I'm not surprised, but I'm extremely pleased to see so many people here today, here in this room and in another one. In fact, of course, this is a clear sign of their interest, but much more than that. Then they all know that you are a man of vision, a man of courage, a man of moral strength, and I'm sure that their presence today is a tribute to your personality.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
As was said by the director, we will now engage in a conversation about your memoir. As you can imagine, a whole book with a number of different topics that is being handled. So we will have to select, and then you will have some time to ask questions, just in case there are issues we don't deal with in a way you wish. I would like, in fact, to start with something personal. I was touched when I read the two first words of the first chapter of your book, My Father. And I understood that in a way you wanted to pay tribute to him, but in another way you also wanted to explain who you are. So I think it would be good for the audience if you could kindly say a few words about how you were influenced and why you wanted to talk about your father.
Thank you very much, Michel. Let me also thank Philippe Burin and Professor Faselli for organizing this evening, and for so many of you for coming, and particularly the students. It really gives me hope that you are interested in multilateral issues, the UN, and the rule of law. And also, I should say, in coming here this evening with Nan, there was no confusion. And we have had situations where people say, oh, here's a man who doesn't need any introduction. And we run into difficulties. I mean, when I stepped down, I decided I was tired. And so Nan and I said, yes, let's get a break. So we took a friend's home in Como region, next to a forest, so that we can go to the forest and walk without going to the village, to be able to stay incognito and rest. And I had thought we can stay there for 3 months, no television, no radio, no newspapers. After 6 weeks, I was getting very bored. So I said, let's go to the village to see if we can get a newspaper. We entered the shop, and within minutes, a group of men standing in the corner were staring at us, and one of them broke away and made for me. And I turned to Nan and said, gosh, we have 6 more weeks to go, and we've blown our cover. How are we going to handle the village? By then, the man was on top of me, and he put his hand out and said, Morgan Freeman. May I have an autograph? So I said, sure. And I signed K. Freeman. He was happy, and we were happy. And we continued our holidays incognito, which was something. But going back to the question you raised, obviously, we all get influenced as we grow up by certain important personalities in our lives. It could be family, it could be at work, it could be at the university and at school. And of course, along the way, I was influenced by many people, many friends. And my father was a big influence on me. He had a strong personality, a rather stoic man, and also played a role in society. He did work for a company, but he was also very aware of the tradition. And so one lived in the two worlds, if you wish, the modern and the traditional. And growing up in my grandmother's house, where all of us were there, all the children, and we talk in terms of the big African family. It's not a unit of 6 or 10. When you talk of a big African family, you can almost always have about 40, 20, 50 people around. And you can talk to them, you can go to them for advice, you can go to them to laugh. And sometimes they will give you advice, solicited or not, you know, and it helps. And it was also, I grew up at a time when Ghana was seeking its independence. So my teenage years were the same years as Ghana struggled for independence. So my most formative years were with the struggle for independence. And in fact, there were two schools. There were those who believed independence had to be attained step by step, and one should be patient and prepare the ground for independence, and those who felt, led by Nkrumah, independence now. And it is better to have independence, even if you live in servitude, than be a colonial subject. My father was with a step-by-step group, as you can imagine, but at school, I was in boarding school, and we were also caught up with this political movement. And we used to play roles. We used to, one day you are opposition leader, the next day you are the head of government, arguing your position. They used to consider me, because of my father's position, as a very strong opposition member. And sometimes the teachers thought I was a troublemaker, which I didn't always agree with them, but sometimes they were right. Sometimes they were right. And so that experience growing up with all those changes taking place had an incredible impact on me. Impact in the sense that, apart from learning from my father, teachers, and schoolmasters, who were very wise, sometimes I recall one master, Branford, coming to the classroom one day and just putting a white sheet, 1 meter by 1 meter, on the board with a black dot in the right-hand corner. And he pulls back and asks us, boys, we were only boys, and I was in a boys' school, boys, what do you see? And all of us in unison shouted, a black dot. So he pulled back and said, not a single one of you saw the broad white sheet, 1 meter by 1 meter. You only saw a black dot. He said, don't go through life focusing on the negative. There's also quite a bit of goodness. Discover that too, and identify them and let it work with you. So you really learn as you go along. So I walked away saying, change is possible, even dramatic change. So throughout my life, I've embraced change wherever possible. I have not hesitated to test or push the envelope. And you worked with me in New York, and sometimes when you put forward ideas and people say it will never fly, the member states will not accept it. It's never been done. My approach is always saying, test it. You may be surprised. Push it. And often we got it done. Sometimes we failed, but that's part of the effort.
Well, thank you very much. That indicates that you sometimes can be very, very bold. And I think that in selecting the title of your memoir, Interventions, in fact, you selected a word that is quite provocative. So if you could kindly please explain why you selected the word, what it is meant to indicate.
Now, first of all, I became Secretary General at a very critical time. I became Secretary General a few years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. Prior to '89, the tensions within the Security Council were such that it wasn't always possible to get the kind of resolution that will allow the organization to take certain actions. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a sort of euphoria in the organization where people felt, finally, we are going to be able to do what the organization was set up to do, without the divisions between the two powers, without either one trying to block us, and we can move ahead. And I think this excitement and euphoria led to certain decisions by the Council without thinking through seriously the consequences. For example, we shifted from peacekeeping operations in interstate situations where you were dealing with established governments, well-organized armies, where the peacekeepers went in to monitor agreements signed by both sides. And so you knew whom you could call on either side. You knew who the commander was, and you could. So often the soldiers went in even unarmed. And in fact, we felt that being unarmed was their best defense, you know. And then suddenly we were thrown into civil war situations, from Somalia to Rwanda to former Yugoslavia, where the governments did not offer the commensurate resources that the peacekeepers need. And often we ran into difficulties. We saw what happened in Somalia, where the peacekeeping operation collapsed when a U.S. helicopter was shot down and American soldiers dragged through the streets. The U.S. decided to pull out, and eventually almost all the Western countries pulled out. They had the best trained and the best equipped army. So when they left, the force had been hollowed out. In the end, the operation had to be closed down. About the same time, we were having painful and heart-wrenching developments in Rwanda. And the UN had a small force of 500 to monitor an agreement between RPF and the government. And of course, the council and everybody, we all treated it as traditional peacekeeping. They've signed an agreement, they would monitor it, but it wasn't an agreement between a government and a government. It was an agreement between a government and an opposing force within this. In a way, you were dealing with a civil war situation. And when things got really out of hand, we were stuck without help. In fact, I recall myself and my staff talking to many governments, wondering if they would give us troops for Rwanda. Nobody would. In fact, the council then reduced the force. And I recall a Canadian military advisor I had, General Dallaire. At that point, we've been thinking about how we increase the capacity of UN peacekeeping operation. We didn't have a standing army. We borrowed the armies from governments as and when we need them. And in fact, we used to joke that the way we were forced to run the operation is a bit like, let's say, telling the mayor of Geneva that, Mayor, we know periodically you have fire. Fire breaks out, and you will need a fire engine. But we'll buy you one when the fire breaks. Because this is the way, it's when the explosion has happened, when the fighting is going on, that we go around looking for peacekeepers, which often takes 3 to 4 months to put in. But what was interesting here is that we had this, what we call a standby forces agreement, where we approach each government to ask, in time of crisis, if you were asked to contribute to a force, what would you offer? Some offered field hospitals, others offered engineering battalion, and a whole sort of thing. So we had it in the system. And I asked Baril to check how it were. Baril came back to me in a relatively short time. He said, sir, we've checked the system and it works. So I said, how many men and women do we have for that? What is the composition of the offers you've made? He said, nobody offered anything. Everybody said no. And he said it has worked in the sense that at least we know where we stand and we are not going to. So, you know, so we had this problem. And then from there you moved into Yugoslavia, where we had a similar operation, where we tried with all our might to try and keep the people alive, through the bombing in Sarajevo and all that, through Srebrenica, which when I say the member states often do not give you the resources which follows. In Srebrenica, we all recall that 8,000 men were marched out by the Serb forces and slaughtered. The UN force, there was a company, a Dutch company, that couldn't really stand up to the well-equipped Serb army. But what was interesting was when the idea of establishing a safe haven came up. I asked one of my generals, Lars Erik Valgren, who had been my commander in southern Lebanon and had done lots of field work, to draw up with other men a plan for the safe haven. He came up with a comprehensive plan saying, one, you're going to need lots of men. You will need 34,600 men to make these safe havens defensible and viable. They have to be fairly wide, about 36 kilometers width, to put them beyond the immediate Serb shooting. So we went to the council, and I brought the generals in to explain to the council. And as Baril says in the book, he said, I thought they were going to lynch me. They were very upset that we put forward a proposal of that size. And they said they changed the language from protection to dissuade, that the peacekeepers should use their presence to dissuade Serb attacks, as if these Serb soldiers were so well behaved that when they see a UN blue helmet, they wouldn't shoot, or they would put their gun down. And because they changed the mandate, they offered 7,600 troops instead of the 34,600 we wanted. And it took 1 year to put that number of troops together. In fact, we had to go as far as Nairobi to Kenya to bring Kenyan troops who hadn't seen snow into the Yugoslav operations. We sent them to Slovakia to get a bit of training on the equipment and then introduce them. And it wasn't as if the troops didn't exist elsewhere, but nobody was offering them.
So this really refers to the time when you were first Assistant Secretary General and then Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations as head of the so-called DPK, or Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And then obviously you took all these lessons. I mean, you requested very candid, thorough studies about why things didn't go the way you would have wanted. And you took all these experiences later on when you became Secretary General.
I mean, you cannot live through those experiences and not be marked. It's something that you think about and it haunts you, and you ask yourself, what can we do to prevent it happening again tomorrow? So when I became Secretary, you're absolutely right. One of the things I kept saying, how can we improve the mechanism? How can we strengthen peacekeeping operations? How can we work with the member states to ensure that if we get into these situations or we take these actions, we are much more effective than we've been in the past. And it was in 1999, you may recall, at the General Assembly session, I challenged the membership to think seriously about how we protect civilians in conflict and raise a question of what happens if tomorrow we are faced with another Rwanda.
But precisely before that, when the decision was taken to militarily intervene in Kosovo, obviously you had in mind that not intervening was wrong, and so intervening should be the right thing to do. But you were confronted with a situation where the Security Council did not give its authorization, and you are very, very well known to support the Charter, to support international law, and there you were caught between, on one hand, the Charter, on the other, ethnic cleansing, and you supported an operation that was not authorized by the Council.
No, yes, we were faced with a situation in Kosovo where we had to take firm action. And in some of these situations, I know you are the lawyer and my legal counselor, sometimes it becomes much more than a question of legal niceties. There are moral imperatives and human lives at risk. And this was a situation in Kosovo where we were dealing with Serb leadership and a Serb army who were capable of incredible brutality. We have seen it in Serbia. We have seen it, the fighting in Croatia. We've seen what had happened in the region. It would have been unconscionable for the United Nations and the UN to sit back and have it repeated in Kosovo and say, well, we couldn't do anything, or we didn't have approval of the Council. And so I felt that there was solid moral grounds to be able to move in. And also the discussions amongst the membership made it clear that in the Council, vast majority of the Council were also in support. But they could not have gotten it through because there would have been a veto. And in fact, subsequently, after the Kosovo invasion, there was a vote where 12 member states voted for let's say, I was going to say invasion, no, but post-military action activities in Kosovo. 12 of them voted for it. In the end, even the Russians who were opposed to it cooperated. It took some time, but they did. And so I think it was a right decision. At the time, I saw it as an exception, not a precedent.
We'll come back to that about Iraq, precisely. But this seems to me tells a lot about why you selected the word interventions, because it means a lot about the way you see sovereignty, the way you see the international community as being much more than just a group of sovereign states.
No, absolutely. I made it clear from the beginning that the UN had to open up to peoples of the world, and that by reaching out to peoples of the world, to the private sector, to universities and foundations and others, we can get a lot more done. And besides, our own charter starts with we, the peoples of the United Nations. And yet, in a way, civil society and peoples were kept out. And in fact, I recall some ambassadors asking me, Mr. Secretary General, who gave you the authority to open the door to civil society, private sector? I think they were even more worried about the private sector than civil society. They thought they would interfere with decisions of the Council, decisions of the General Assembly. I said there was no way they could do it. But then I told them, turn to the first chapter of your own charter. It talks of we, the peoples. And I also felt that governments have responsibility towards the people. All power resides in the people, and the governments had to realize that their responsibility to the people, their welfare, their protection were primary function of the trust and the power vested in them, not the other way around. And in fact, it was also around the time when there was lots of discussion about human security. And the UN had become, I saw it as an organization of states which was so focused on protecting their rights and their interests. But rights and interests for what? It's all for the protection of the people. If you have these construct, even if you go back to treaties of Westphalia, that was all intended to reduce conflict, to reduce violence, and therefore the protection of the people. But I think in the end, most of the member states understood, because I asked that we had to ask ourselves, what can the UN do? What can the UN do alone? What does the UN have to do with others? What does the UN have to leave others to do? Or what does the UN simply sit on the line and say, this is not for... And I think they realized as we went through it that by working in partnership with civil society, the private sector, and these institutions, we were able to expand our capacity without going to the same governments to ask for more money. They wouldn't have given it to us anyway. And when you look at the efforts we made with on HIV/AIDS, and the way we were able to raise funds through the Global Fund, getting $22 billion so far, the way we got the pharmaceutical industry to make major contribution at a time when the cost per patient was 15,000. Over time, we got them to come to 150 for the poorer countries. So intervention in all its forms, both on the way in conflict situations, helping people who are sick, getting civil society to play a role, and also empowering them, empowering civil society by some of the decisions of the Council and the General Assembly, which encourage them to take on, take on perhaps, is to put fire under their leaders when they are not doing the right thing. What's important.
So it's in a way sovereignty not only as entailing rights but duties, sovereignty as responsibility, and the international community not only of states but of people. With at the root, as you wrote in the book, as you write, human dignity as a fundamental principle.
No, not only is it a fundamental principle. Today there are lots of things governments cannot do alone. Even issues of international relations. It's not a matter for governments alone. The people-to-people contacts, when you see the robust civil society across borders, the way prominent businessmen travel the world and the contacts they make, they are all playing part of this international relation, and you need them. And governments have to understand that not only they cannot do it alone, the world has changed. And the issues we are dealing with can only be handled, I call them problems with our passports. You know, they cross borders easily. They had to get together with other governments to resolve these issues. No country, however powerful, can resolve it alone. And this multilateral effort in working in partnership with other stakeholders makes it easier for us to tackle issues like the climate change, we had a question of diseases and other problems that confront us.
Now, all that was possible because your first mandate was extremely successful, and a number of decisive achievements were made, and you completely restored the credibility of the United Nations, and at the end you won with the UN the Nobel Peace Prize. I would definitely like to hear you about the achievements, but definitely I see the time running, and we definitely need to talk also about the decisive moments, and in particular 9/11. So if you want to say a few words about the key achievements and what was decisive there, but then I think that we'll have to move to the other part.
I think during the first term, we were able really to open up the UN to the wider public. We were able to work very harmoniously, or the member states worked very harmoniously together. And they were open to ideas, to suggestions, and they really wanted to work together to achieve things. And so during that period, which also coincided with the millennium, we could get them to shift focus and talk about how we help the poor. And that's when we came up with the Millennium Development Goals, the 8 goals to help the poor people, establishing almost basic minimum requirements for the protection of the poor, from primary education to reducing hunger by 50%, maternity, child care, and a whole series of things. We were able to encourage them and introduce issues like HIV/AIDS, which eventually, with my good friend, late friend, Holbrooke, was even discussed in the Security Council, using it as a security issue so that the Council could take it up. And on the questions of rule of law and others, and the banning of landmines, there was lots of activities and enthusiasm for it. Even US, that was not paying its dues at the time, worked with us to get these things done. But then, of course, post 9/11, things changed. 9/11 really divided the world. It divided the organization, And in fact, in the book, I refer to 9/11 wars. You know, not only did we have the war in Afghanistan, we had the heedless rush to war in Iraq, and then we had the war on terror, which in some ways was also a war on civil liberties and rights. And this tendency for one to feel that there could be a trade-off between security and civil liberties. And the question I used to ask them, when you are asked to give up your civil liberties, your human rights, to get protection, and you give up those rights, do you in the end have protection? What protects you? Who protects you? You know.
It was really striking because immediately after 9/11, it was almost taboo to speak about human rights in these contexts, about due process.
Yeah.
And in fact, I witnessed how you dared tell the Security Council what you thought about it, which was kind of surprising because members, and especially permanent members of the Security Council, would not want to hear from the Secretary General what he thinks about issues like this one.
Yeah, no, but I think there are times when the Secretary General has to speak up on issues like this. You know, there's always been this tension as to what the role of the Secretary General is, and they often ask the question, is he a secretary or a general? Should he be more of a secretary or a general? And I always maintain the Secretary General has to be both. There are times when he has to be a general and show the lead, like in the situation after 9/11. And there are times when he has to be a secretary and support the member states. But you cannot be an effective Secretary General if you allow yourselves to be reduced to a secretary and you can take no initiatives, you cannot speak up, and you cannot challenge. And you would also recall that there were many occasions where we had issues where the council was locked in disagreement, where they couldn't decide what position to take. And I, using my own authority, will put out a statement. This is a position. And on several occasions, they came up and said, we support the Secretary General's position. And that became also the position of the council. So I think the Secretary General sometimes has a responsibility to to help the member states by facilitating transactions and understanding between them. And when there are divisions between the member states, the Secretary General has a role in helping to heal it, although sometimes people will tell you get squeezed in the middle, but that's part of the job.
But that's definitely, I mean, a case where you were much more a general than a secretary after or just before, immediately before the military intervention in Iraq, and after it, when obviously it was a major controversy in the international community about the legality of the intervention. And there in September of 2004, in the course of an interview with a BBC journalist, you in fact made your position clear.
Yeah. What was interesting about that interview is my position had been clear all along, but I had not used the word illegal. About even 18 months earlier, I had said for anyone to go to Iraq and to attack Iraq without council approval would be in contravention of the charter. And I kept asking them, what happens the day after the bombing? Because everybody agreed they would win the war. But how do you win the peace? How do you put the thing together? In fact, it was Colin Powell who in one situation has said, you broke it and you own it. Yeah, it's nice to break it and own it, but the Iraqis have to live with the consequences. But I think my position was clear. And of course, when I said it was illegal, they got very upset. The council, any country has a right to defend itself if it's attacked or there's possibility of an imminent attack to protect and defend itself. But when it comes to issues of broader peace and security concerning the broader international community and all of us, we cannot accept that a country or group of countries take it upon themselves that they are going to take action. The council sent in the inspectors. Remember, they had been out for quite some time, and I had to negotiate very hard with the Iraqis to get them back in. So Dr. Bliss and Dr. El Beradi were doing their work. When they submitted the first report, the council indicated Saddam must cooperate or there would be consequences. And the inspectors were not allowed to come back with their second report and complete their work. The Americans and their allies decided they didn't have the time and they were going in. And yet, logically, if it is a council that has a responsibility, and it is a council that maintains that if Iraq did not perform, there would be consequences, they had to make the judgment that Iraq had not performed, and second, what the consequences should be. It wasn't for a group of countries to jump the gun on the pretext that there was weapons of mass destruction, which in the end they did not find. And by the way, on this one, it was interesting. There was a very prominent Iraqi diplomat, Ismat Kitani, who is unfortunately no longer with us. We were having lunch once before this, and Ismat asked me, he said, there's all this fuss about Saddam and the weapons of mass destruction. What if he's bluffing? He doesn't have the weapons. I said, you mean he lives in a bad neighborhood and he's really bluffing, telling the neighbors, don't mess with me. I have all these powerful weapons. If you do, I would wipe you out. And in the end, that's what it turned out to be. I mean, the first Gulf War in 2001 destroyed quite a lot of weapons. They wiped out their air defense systems. And the UN inspectors from 2001 to 2006 on the roll for chaos destroyed, in fact, more weapons than all the bombing did. So he had really been, his weapons had been destroyed and diluted. But of course, we all know the story now.
Yes, and I mean, when you used the expression, it was in the middle of a fierce presidential campaign in the United States, and in addition to that, you had decided to create an investigation on the difficulties experienced by the program Oil for Food, and that's what you wanted. You wanted to really clear everything, clean thing, but then this investigation was instrumentalized in a way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they used it to hit me on the head, and also the UN. And obviously, we didn't do everything right in terms of managing the program. And I kept saying, but the objectives were achieved. The objectives of feeding 26 million Iraqis. And it was so thorough that, in fact, when we had the first elections, it was the cards we used for distribution, which became the basis for registration for the elections. And we did our work. The Volcker Commission indicated there were a mismanagement, which we accept. But when they talk of corruption, the corruption was in the capitals. All the 2,000 companies that bribed Saddam to get contracts, quite a lot of them came from the permanent members who were supposed to implement the resolution they passed. And in fact, on the oil, quite a lot of the smuggling, which was done directly by Saddam through Turkey, Jordan, and all, they were aware of it. The member states, and they had planes in the air, you know, checking on everything. But of course, it was convenient to dump it all on the UN and to beat us. I was a bit disappointed at the time that the member states did not speak up. But of course, later on, you notice when I appeared in the General Assembly to speak to them, they all stood up and gave me a standing ovation, which I felt was their way of redeeming themselves and saying, we are sorry, and we knew what was going on. And this is a General Assembly that doesn't do that, rarely. I recall President Bush telling me, Kofi, this General Assembly is a tough place to talk. Nobody claps. Nobody gets up. They listen silently. You finish, they sit silently and watch you walk out. Of course, when you compare this with the Congress, where they are up and down, it's very disappointing, very difficult.
And this moment was really emotional and impressive. I witnessed that's exactly, and that gave you the necessary strength to make out of the crisis an opportunity for change, for reform. Yeah. And we were about to experience the 6 years anniversary of the United Nations in 2005, and there you made a lot of proposals. So, and a number of them are very well known, but still I think that it would be important if you could identify those that are closer to your hearts in a few words.
No, yes, I decided to put forth some proposals, including attempts to reform the Security Council, with very solid proposals, which I think someday they will have to reform the Council. It had to be sooner rather than later. With the new emerging countries coming on board, they will not sit back and not have a seat at the table, and so the pressure will be on. I also put together a group of 16 wise women and men to do a report on threats, challenges, and change in the new century. And they were very good. They came up with a list, clusters of about 8 threats that we should worry about. Wars between states and within states, weapons of mass destruction, internationally organized crime, environmental degradation, and name it, and made some suggestions as to how we could cope. But one of the most important one, and of course that was also when we created the Human Rights Council, the Peacekeeping Commission, and responsibility to protect, which I think is an important norm. It will take time to be fully realized. But basically, the concept of the responsibility to protect is to insist that governments have a responsibility towards their citizens, and they have to protect them from genocide, crimes against humanity, and other serious crimes. And where the government is either unable or unwilling to do it, the international community, in the form of the Security Council, has a responsibility to do it. The importance of this norm is that we are telling dictators and autocrats that you can no longer hide behind sovereignty and brutalize your own people. You have a responsibility, and where you fail, the international community may intervene. But we are also telling the international community and those countries outside that particular country that you also have no excuse. You cannot say we will not intervene or we cannot do anything because it's an internal affair. Some crimes are so shameful, disgraceful, and unacceptable that we cannot sit back. And we may not always succeed, but we need to wake up every morning ready to fight it and do something to help.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the questions, I really think that it would be important for you to at least mention in a few words Kenya, because this is very timely. And if you could, in a few words, also say what were the ingredients that made the success of your mediation in Kenya, and what of these ingredients were not present in Syria? I think if a comparison could be...
No, very quickly then. About 5 years ago, in December 2007, there were national elections in Kenya, and when the results were announced, the opposition felt they had been cheated. And in fact, the elections were announced and the president sworn in very quickly at midnight. And so all hell broke loose, and 1,300 people were killed and about 650,000 people uprooted. And I was invited by the African Union to go in with 2 other panel members, Graça Machel, the wife of Nelson Mandela, and former President Benin Kappa of Tanzania, to help calm the situation. And we negotiated an agreement between the parties, and they formed a coalition government. It was not an easy one. It was interesting that the government party said it had won the presidential elections. In terms of parliamentary seats, the opposition had won more seats than the government. So putting together the coalition was the only way to go, because neither side could have run the government without the other. And we, as part of it, we also came up with a reform plan, including a new constitution, which was adopted 2 years ago, and on which the last elections were held beginning of March. But the difference here is that compared to Syria, first of all, we worked very closely with civil society. I went to Kenya several times a year, and not only did I meet with the government leaders, I met civil society, business leaders, women's organizations, religious leaders, telling them, this is your agreement. Don't leave it to the politicians alone. Insist that it be implemented. So they stayed engaged. But the key for success was that internationally, everyone cooperated. The African Union, the UN, the European Union, Russia, everybody. And even when sometimes prominent people from Europe and America wanted to come in, they would check with me, or I would call them and say, this is not the time, don't come, it will be exploited. And so we worked really, really very closely, and they put concerted pressure on the Kenyan political elite to come to a settlement. This is completely lacking in Syria. The Syria obviously is divided, the region is divided, and the international community in the form of Security Council is also hopelessly divided. And this is why I made a serious attempt to help resolve it with a 6-point plan. And of course, the Geneva communique of June last year, which they should have built on and did not, because that communique indicated we needed political settlement, and we also needed a transitional government with full executive authority. And at that meeting, all the foreign ministers of the Permanent Five who came to Geneva for that meeting signed on. Once you talk of a transitional government with full executive authority, it means the existing government is on its way out, and you're going to work to make a change. But they didn't do that. They went to New York and started fighting again. That's when I decided they were not serious. And I made the comment that I lost my team on the road to Damascus. I turned around and they were not there. They were busy fighting each other. So I didn't see the point of continuing. And it's very tragic what's happening in Syria. When I took on the job in February, March last year, 7,500 Syrians had been killed. Today, the figure is 70,000, and I think that's gross underestimation. You have more than 1 million refugees outside Syria. You have 2.5 million internally displaced, and you have between 1 and 1.5 million Syrians in need. And the assistance is not reaching them fast enough, but we are fighting to put in more guns. Thank you.
There is definitely one thing that I personally need to say. We've been talking about your role, your function, etc., but there is somebody who was always at your side, somebody who in a remarkable way struck a fantastic balance between being present, supporting you, and being discreet. And I really definitely want to pay tribute to your wife, Nan, for her remarkable role.
Yeah. No, but I think you need to hear a little bit more about it. I mean, Nicola was there with me in New York, and I see his wife Fanny is also here. But what was interesting was we traveled a lot together. Nan traveled with me. And when we get into a city, I had the boring responsibility of going to my program, was rather boring, going from airport to a meeting in the presidency, then to lunch or dinner. And she had a program where she would get out there working on women's empowerment, children's education, visiting HIV/AIDS patient. And then when she comes home and we compare notes, I turned to her and I said, but your program was more interesting. I wish I had yours. But there was also another aspect which was quite, anyway, for those of you in the same profession, which was very effective. Because at the end of the day, usually you have dinner with the president and the high. And entre le poil et fromage, as you say here, she said, Mr. President, in a very soft, quiet way, the women of such and such a village gave me this message for you. Or I visited the school, and the buildings were nice, but they were short of teachers, you know, and passing on the message delicately. And so after a while, the UN said, we have one for two, and they did because she didn't get paid.
Well, thank you very much. And now it's for you to ask questions. Here's the...
Good evening. Thank you for coming to Geneva, Mr. Annan. I'm Isabella Criseo. I would like to know, with your experience, if you could suggest something to ordinary people who are not involved in resolving major conflicts, something to do at our individual modest level to make this world a better place.
Mm-hmm. No, there's always something each of us can do. I think the main thing is sometimes we cripple ourselves and we become incapacitated because we think in terms of the big issues, you know, of what can I do, and sometimes the nature of the issues we are looking at overwhelms us. But to do something to make the world better always begins in our own communities. You can do something at the local level, in your school, or team up with your friends to do things. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to think about how do I help resolve Syria, or how do I, but it can be contribution, whether it's on the climate change, what can we do to improve our own climate, organize yourself with your friends to get things done. And the other thing I would also suggest, and I think you are all going to be very active professionally and in politics, is the issues that are of concern to you. You should raise your voices. Not only you should raise your voices, organize yourselves and get it higher up the political agenda. And the politicians will take it up. If you don't shout, if you don't make the noise, if you don't get it up the agenda, they are not going to take it up. And I'm going to say something that may sound subversive, but I do not mean it that way. That I've always maintained, when leaders fail to lead, the people can make them follow. And you do that by raising your voice, getting organized with others. And we've had some wonderful examples this year, in India in particular. We all saw what happened with the rape case on the Indian television. The government and everybody knew that the situation was hopeless, but people took to the streets and led, and the government followed. We had the same with corruption. Hana Azari in India, who mounted a hunger strike with millions joining him, and again the law came. And I can go on with other examples. So people are not powerless. As individuals, you have power. You have power on how you, and you have to know how you use it. Even on the question of environment, you can make choices. What you buy, you can buy green. You can decide this company is polluting and I'm not buying their products. So there are things you can do.
Thank you very much. I see several hands, so we might take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Sir.
Monsieur Kofi Annan, je vous ai rencontré la première fois les années 80 quand vous étiez encore au commissariat des Nations Unies pour les réfugiés. Depuis ce jour-là, vous êtes toujours optimiste et dynamique. Le mois prochain, vous aurez 75 ans. Je me pose la question, quel est votre secret pour rester toujours jeune? Ça, c'est la première question. La toute première question. Deuxième question, c'est que de tout le temps de l'histoire de l'humanité, il y a un grand débat entre la guerre juste et la guerre injuste. Quel est votre point de vue que vous n'êtes plus secrétaire général des Nations Unies sur la question de guerre juste? Je vous remercie beaucoup, monsieur Kofi Annan.
Alors, Madame.
Alors bonsoir Monsieur Annan et félicitations et merci pour tout ce que vous représentez et ce que vous avez fait durant votre parcours professionnel. Donc j'interviens aujourd'hui parce qu'on a eu l'occasion de se croiser le 11 mars en sortie d'un ascenseur au Palais des Nations. Donc nous étions en conférence pour la coalition mondiale pour les objectifs du millénaire, donc par rapport à la coalition des ONG dont vous êtes à l'initiative. Si je peux me permettre, d'à peu près il y a 10 ans, vous avez été... grâce à vous, ça a pu aboutir à certaines choses. Et je prends la parole aujourd'hui, donc j'ai un peu le trac, je suis désolée. Mais je prends la parole aujourd'hui pour vous demander de nous appuyer encore une fois par votre image pour ce que vous avez créé il y a une dizaine d'années. Et je vous propose de venir intervenir au centre de ressources des ONG où nous collaborons avec Monsieur Ricardo Espinosa pour appuyer les combats que nous avons actuellement en Afrique, en Colombie et localement. Voilà, merci.
Merci.
Madame.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary General, for, as usual, providing very illuminating comments and insights. My question is, you presided over the UN as Secretary General at the time of the development of the MDGs. I suppose I'm wondering, where do you see the post-2015 development agenda going? What areas of focus do you think the post-2015 agenda should really focus on? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we will take these one, Mr. Sargon.
Let me react very quickly. Thank you for recognizing that I'm youthful. But these days, everything is changing now in our world. You know, Warren Buffett has decided that middle age now doesn't end till 84. So we have lots of young middle-aged people who are still active. And on the question of just war, I think the discussion we had now about Kosovo, for example, is something that I would say comes closest to it. Taking a sort of preventive action, taking action that you know will prevent worst disaster. I think the question we need to ask ourselves when we decide to use force is, does it do more harm? Would it help? And if not, why should you think there's a tendency for some people to think you must always intervene, you must always rush in the army, and it is not always the best way. I think it's very difficult for us as individuals to know when to sit, because I believe there's time to sit and let things happen, because whatever you do wouldn't make any difference. And there is time to move and make things happen. And you should know the difference between those two. And I think on the just war issue, I will give you the Kosovo example. But my own view is in wars where people come up and think they are victorious, they have won and all. Honestly, in war, if we look at it from a moral, ethical point of view, there are no winners. Even those who win often have to do incredible things, commit incredible terrible times, and that they have to live with to be able to defend. So if we can, and I know it sounds a bit idealistic, we should really try and avoid wars. But there are times when I said you may need to put force to the service of peace, and Kosovo was one of those situations. And thank you for the questions about the MDGs. And I will think about how I join you and Spinoza and the NGOs to discuss the MDGs. Be in touch with my office, and we'll see what we can do. On the question of post-2015 MDG focus, that's a tricky one for me. It sounds like a straightforward question. A tricky one because Secretary General Ban and the task force are working on it and deciding what to do and where they should go. Tricky because I was also the one to come up with the MDGs, and I don't want whatever I say to sound as if I'm protecting TEF or I'm telling my successor what to do. I did it my way and he's going to do it his way. But let me say that I see the 8 MDGs as a minimum, is the floor, is the most basic any one of us on this earth should have. So, and since it was launched, it has lifted millions out of poverty. And some countries have made very good progress, whether it's on primary education, on drinking water, or whatever. But they will not meet all the goals. If by 2015 they have not met these goals, they should persevere. They cannot give up. If it's a basic minimum and a floor, you have to strive to achieve it for everybody. Those countries who have achieved it can move to the next level. They can go higher. If everybody has been given primary education and you want to move to secondary education, so be it. But I know the discussions going on in New York with the task force are looking at the question of sustainable development, environmental degradation, governance, human rights, and a whole host of issues. And I think the debate is going on. They have another couple of months to prepare a report for September, and I would not really want to prejudge what the Secretary General decides to do. Thanks.
If you allow me, may I just simply say, for the sake of avoiding a risk of misunderstanding, that about the use of force, you always insisted on the need to respect the Charter.
That's correct.
And when in your report, in Larger Freedom, when you proposed the concept of the responsibility to protect to the General Assembly, you insisted on saying, this is not an attempt at replacing the Security Council, but at making the system of collective security work.
And not only that, I also indicated that the kind of intervention we were seeking on the responsibility to protect had to start with political, diplomatic, economic pressure and all sorts of pressures to get the governments to bend. And force can be used as a last resort. And since you raise this issue, let me add one more point. You often hear the comment, why isn't the UN intervening in Syria? Why has it intervened in Libya or in this country but not there? Obviously, we cannot intervene everywhere. But the fact that you cannot intervene everywhere does not mean you should not intervene where you can. In fact, I often say we insist we can only intervene, we should intervene everywhere, and if you can't intervene everywhere, don't intervene anywhere. It's a bit like telling the Geneva police, if you can't arrest all criminals, don't arrest anybody, not even those you can. And so it's but I think the whole concept, that's why the Kenyan example is interesting. It's not necessarily force, you know.
Thank you, thank you. Well, so many hands. I'm sorry, I will have to make a selection. Yes, madam.
And maybe look at the left and maybe someone this seat.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Kofi Annan. Thank you, Professor Nicolas Michel. Thank you for being inspiration for many. I would like to know your opinion about Western Sahara. Do you think there will be a referendum someday? And have you ever tried to negotiate with Polisario, Algeria, Moroccan government? Thank you.
Okay.
Let us also take questions
we'll take several.
Yes, yeah. Please.
Thank you. It's Alice Penapinto, Durham University Law School. My question is a didactic one. I have the fortune and misfortune of teaching some very sceptical first years in both international law and international relations. So my question is, do you have a message, perhaps 3 points for me to relate back when I go back to Durham, in encouraging them to engage with UN issues and perhaps be a bit less sceptical? Thank you.
There, yes.
Bonsoir, je suis Steve Bannock, étudiant à l'Université Westford de Genève, étudiant camerounais. L'Afrique, aujourd'hui, j'ai une question à deux volets. L'Afrique, selon vous, a-t-elle des chances d'avoir des représentants au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies? Et si c'est le cas, cette place pourrait-elle aider l'Afrique à la résolution des problèmes que rencontre le continent de nos jours? Merci.
Yes. Go ahead. Yes.
You had mentioned that the international community needs to be careful about deciding where and when to intervene. I was curious, with the Syrian conflict, would you think that now is an appropriate time to intervene? Should that hold off? Should it have been done earlier? Thank you.
Okay, we can take two more.
So, yeah, yes. Up there, up, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kofi Annan, for coming here. What you just said, that you should intervene when you can. Isn't there a risk that intervention becomes a tool for the powerful states to impose their own interests? And what can we do to avoid that? Thank you.
And one more. Yes, madam.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask your opinion on the proposition of the reform of the Security Council of the S5. Thank you.
Okay. Let me, on Polisario, yes, I did negotiate this Polisario issue for about 8 years. In fact, at one point I was so hopeful that I got a very good mediator, one of the best in the world, in my opinion, to work on that issue. I got James Baker, the former Secretary of State of the US, to handle the Polisario issue between Morocco, Algeria, and Polisario. And I met with all three on many occasions, and we discussed that the issue of self-determination was on the table, which Morocco felt it should be a question of autonomy and not a self-determination leading to independence. And after many discussions and negotiations and trips to the region, Jim Baker came to me and said, Kofi, you asked me to give you a year, and it is true. I asked him to give me a year. He said, I've given you 6 years. I've tried every trick I know, and I have not succeeded, and I'm giving it back to you. So he handed it back to me, and I, of course, left and handed it back, handed it to my successor, who is now dealing with the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. But we did work a lot on Polisario, or Western Sahara, I should say. Your skeptical first-year students, I think you have to start by, I'm really surprised at that age they are that skeptical. You have to start by opening their eyes and exposing them to some of the realities of the world we live in. Because normally, of course, now I should take it back. I mean, when they look around them with the issues that are confronting us today, I'm not surprised that some of them would be coldly realistic and skeptical to the kind of outwardly philosophical issues that we talk about at the UN, and we talk of multinationalism, and we are all in one boat, when in fact they are worried about jobs, about something very real. But at the same time, from my own experience, as I travel around the world, I come across many, many young people who are very hopeful, who are very enthusiastic, who want change, but they also want to be part of the change. And I encourage and push them to be the change that they want to see and become engaged and become involved. And maybe what you can do to open the eyes of your skeptical first-year students is to find a project that exposes them to some of the challenges we try to solve across borders or with other partners, problems that you can't solve alone. Let them try and solve it alone, and then try to work in partnership with us and see which one succeeds. And it may make your work a bit easier. On the Africa and the Security Council reform, let me take both together. One of my proposals for Security Council reform was the fact that we should create additional Security Council seats without veto. First of all, the composition of the Council today is based on the geopolitical realities of 1945. The world has changed. And to think that we have a Security Council today where India, with about a fifth of the world's population, it doesn't have a seat. The whole of Latin America doesn't have a single permanent seat. Africa, with 54 states, doesn't have a single seat. And of course, you have issues like Japan, second contributor, also without a seat, and I could go on. So the suggestion was that we should create additional seats, one for Latin America, which means the Americas will have two seats for Africa, one probably for Asia, which could be India. But of course, the question is the regions would have to agree where these seats go to. And the problem was not always with the big boys. Obviously, when you look at it in terms of Europe with 3 permanent seats, and I really believe if we reform the Council along the lines that I was suggesting, the Council would have become more democratic, more representative, and gain in greater legitimacy. But it didn't work. For example, when you take the African, see, at that point we said 2 seats. Immediately Egypt said, great, 1 seat for North Africa and 1 for south of the Sahara. The 3 candidates were Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. Nigeria and South Africa immediately said, no, we compete. May the best countries win. There's no difference between North and South. Latin America, Brazil thought itself as a natural. And I received the former president of Argentina, Carlos Menem. We had a very good conversation, and at the end he looked at me straight in the eye. I said, Mr. Secretary General, things are going extremely well in my region. We are getting on well with Chile, with Brazil, with Uruguay, and all our neighbors. This has not happened in a long time. Now tell me, Mr. Secretary General, why do you want to give us something to fight over? This discussion about a permanent seat. So I said, Mr. President, if Brazil were to hear this, they would consider it an unfriendly act. But we left it there. So it's a very complex issue, but hopefully we will find the courage and the means to reform the Council. On the question of Syria, obviously there are 2 approaches that one can take to Syria. This was true when I was dealing with it, and it's true today. Either one decides that we need to find a political settlement and find a way of resolving the issue, assuring that the interest of all groups in Syria will be protected, and coming up with an approach that will help stabilize and handle post-conflict Syria. In other words, you take initiatives to try and stop the fighting. You can also say, let the war dictate what happens. Let them fight, and at the end of the fighting, the logic of the battlefield will determine who won and what happens. Obviously, these are two approaches you can take. And they both have risks. If you start negotiating a political settlement along the lines the parties, the ministers agreed here in Geneva on 30 June, it is likely that it will drag on, and some would argue Assad and others will play for time, and things will drag on. But at least it would have offered an alternative. You're telling them, if you stop fighting, this is a framework that will allow you to build a future Syria and avoid a chaotic collapse. If you go the military route and you allow the war to dictate what happens, you are certainly likely to get a chaotic collapse. I think you are going to see the situation get much, much worse before it gets better. Because those who think they have won, there will be revenge killings, there will be ethnic cleansing of the other, and we are likely going to see a chaotic collapse. And you may also see the sectarian war spreading throughout the region. Already it's affecting its neighbors. So when people say let's intervene in Syria, I really don't see the prospects for military intervention in Syria today. We've left it too late, and I'm not sure it will not do more harm. Of course, some are saying let's put in more weapons. There are lots of weapons in Syria and lots of different militias and different groups, and putting in more weapons and further militarization of the conflict, I'm not sure it's a way to help the Syrian people. From my own involvement, when you talk to the Syrians and the people, they are all waiting for stability, for peace, for the killing to stop. How do we stop the killing? When does the shooting start? But I find that some of those away from Syria are the ones who are very keen on putting in more weapons and doing this. So my own view is we should really continue, as late as it is, try and find a way of pouring water on the fire rather than going the other way around. On the question of intervention, I think the point you raise is not is valid in the sense that when we first started talking about the whole question of responsibility to protect, I recall the strongest reaction to my statement in the General Assembly in 1999 about responsibility to protect citizens and that the international community can intervene to protect came from President Bouteflika of Algeria, on the point that you were making that one has to be careful that it doesn't become an excuse or a license for powerful countries to intervene in weaker ones. And this is where, in effect, the whole question of humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, does require Security Council resolution. And in fact, this has been a problem with Syria too, because the Council took a decision on Libya, applying responsibility to protect. China and Russia abstained. They did not veto the resolution. They could have, to allow the operation to go forward. Today they believe they were deceived and that the resolution, which was to protect the population, was turned very quickly into regime change, and Gaddafi was toppled and killed. So when you talk about Syria, I mean, I raised with them the question of arms embargo in Syria. They see it as a beginning of a slippery slope, another Libya. And we are not going to get into that again. So it has to be applied fairly and firmly and in a manner that doesn't lead to this sort of debate. I really believe there's been very serious miscalculations on Syria. Many governments thought it was going to be a short war. They saw it as another Libya and began replicating what they did in Libya. Friends of Libya, friends of Syria, and it went on. And when it was obvious to me, when I got involved, that it was going to go on for a long time. And I stated openly that from my point of view, Libya, unlike Syria, unlike Libya, was not going to implode. And Syria was likely to explode way beyond its borders with unimaginable consequences that we cannot handle. And I still worry about that today. Thank you.
Thank you so very much,
Yeah.
dear Secretary General. I'm sure it will be fascinating to continue, but I understand that now we have come to the end, and it will be for the rector of the University of Geneva, Professor Vassalli, to take the floor.
Mesdames et Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, let me, on your behalf, Nicolas Michel, of course, but in particular Kofi Annan, for having shared with us some of those exceptional moments.
I want to help you.
Thank you for having helped me be more audible. This is what the United Nations is all about. Power to the people and giving the civil sector some way to have access to the podium. When we invited you, Mr. Annan, with Philippe Burin, you immediately accepted our invitation to come and present and share with us your book. And I was, of course, extremely happy about this. And I understood more why this was the case by hearing you telling us how it is important to reach out for the United Nations, to civil society, and you said in particular to universities, and that reaching out to universities can hopefully help more to be achieved. I would hope from a university point of view that this is true, and that by joining the forces between the multilateral aspects of international organizations such as the UN and the multidisciplinary aspects that universities can provide, that this indeed may provide some contribution to improving the world. And in that sense, Philippe Burin mentioned that Geneva is a provincial town, and of course we need to agree. However, I think it's not any provincial town. I think the fact that, and all of you here are a witness to this, the fact that Geneva is such an incredible town because it is a siege of the European siege of the United Nations, also because it is a siege of very remarkable academic institutions, a graduate institute, the University of Geneva. I think Geneva in that sense is a very special place for the kind of nexus between the world of international organizations and the world of the civil society. And therefore, I would like, ladies and gentlemen, to, on your behalf once again, thank Kofi Annan. I would like to say that he told us that speaking in front of the General Assembly was a tough place. It was a tough place to talk. Nobody would clap, nobody would get up. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask you to get up and clap for Kofi Annan.
Thank you. Thank you. Good. Good. That's it.